Hello, my name is Anum, and I will be doing a motion debrief for a motion that we set at UADC 2023. It's one of my favorites from that particular year. It reads as, this House believes that artists from minority groups, in order to depict the experiences of their community, should primarily rely on speculative art as opposed to representational art. And the definition or distinction between the both is given within the info slide, along with a couple of examples that I think are fairly well known. I think the motion is quite accessible, but also has a lot of room to play around with interesting ideas regarding representation or the experiences of minorities and why they might be better communicated with certain artistic techniques. So yeah, let's get straight into the arguments or the way that both sides might approach the broad questions or clashes within the debate. Oh, just a quick disclaimer is that as is the case with most art debates, it's good to not just rely on the examples given within the info slide, but rather to extract knowledge and extract arguments from pieces of work that you are most familiar with. These are just well-known examples, but of course, there are countless examples of what speculative art or representational art can look like that and examples that are nothing like the ones that we have given. So feel free to extract arguments from your understanding of whatever you have seen. Okay, I think the broad clashes or questions for this debate are firstly, where do you get just better quality of art making? And this is perhaps irrespective of how it's likely to be perceived and such, and both sides are also very free to characterize what good quality art actually means, according to what they think is the most important metric for art, judging art. The second thing is on audience and outreach. Where do you just get more eyes on your work? Thirdly is on connection or engagement. So the audience that you do have, how do you make them engage with your piece of art or connect to it or relate to it, or just enjoy it in a way that is important to you? And fourthly, in terms of political and social critique, I think it's generally implied or quite intuitive when you talk about minority artists making art about their community that there's bound to be some level of commentary or critique on existing or past political or social structures that have shaped the way that their community is treated or has been, allowed to exist. So I think based on those sort of four broad goals or clashes, there are a couple of ideas that I'm going to talk about for both prop and op. In terms of just this idea of better storytelling or where do you get better quality of storytelling and art, there are a couple of ways you can approach this. Firstly is, I think, just to emphasize the importance of creative freedom. This is, of course, premised on this framing that creative freedom or artistic freedom, whatever you want to call it, is the most important prerequisite to getting art and stories made in the real world that are authentic, distinct, unique, meaningful. Because the more creative freedom you allow artists, the more they can experiment with new concepts or new ideas or new techniques. And the more freedom you give to them, the more they are able to be the most authentic versions of their, artistic self. And that the more authentic they are necessarily means that they come up with stories that are highly personal or highly unique, that are nothing like things that other people have done in the past or are doing currently. Why do you get that on prop side of the house? Firstly, I think you need to prove that there is less oversight when it comes to speculative art, and that's a good thing. I think that the mech over here is that representational art oftentimes comes with a lot of strings or comes with a lot of procedures you have to follow or things you need to do. For example, if you are directly borrowing from real world stories that have happened, you will oftentimes need the consent or permission from the people that you are trying to depict or their families and whatnot. Or if you're trying to talk about a particular event in history or a particular location, then there might be leaders that you need to consult. There might be existing knowledge or information or literature made that you might need to do a lot of thorough research on in order to get your facts straight and be able to make the thing you want to do. And the thing is that a lot of this then research doesn't just translate to you having more knowledge. It oftentimes translates to you being restricted in the thing that you want to convey within your film or the thing that you want to show. And of course, this can also look like very direct supervision from community leaders who have a direct stake in the way that the world perceives your community or the incident you're trying to comment on or portray within your art. So all of this is to say that you probably eliminate a large chunk of that when your story or your piece of art relies on a more fantastical or fictional setting that don't have ties to real world people or groups that representational art might. And similar to this, I think the second thing is that you as an artist are then inherently um, predicting or predicting or worried about the fact that accuracy is going to be a benchmark for how your work is judged, because representational art oftentimes means that the first line of criticism or the first line or the first lens that people view your work through is the lens of accuracy, and whether or not you were able to like sort of checkbox all of the things that actually happened in real life that pertained to the story you are telling. And the third thing, of course, is that with real world, you are bound by real world physics. So this looks like in speculative art, you having more room to question or reimagine what things like race, gender, sexuality even mean or can look like, or play around with very, very experimental ways of depicting time and space that you don't necessarily get with representational art, because you are sort of bound to show these things in a manner that is in a manner that actually resembles how these things look like in real life. I think apart from this, there's another sort of tangent to this broad idea of why this is better quality art, in the sense that I think you can argue that there are more diverse ways of visualizing what empowerment can look like on like prop side of the house. I think this is proven in through two different ways. Firstly, I think you just can talk about the ways in which representational art is currently limited by the ways that your community is perceived currently in the real world. So because you need to cater to big institutions like film festivals or art galleries or museums that or literary agents that oftentimes are dominated by people who are not from your community, those people are unaware of the nuances or why certain things might be important to your community if those things are not well known. The default perception of majoritarian groups about your community often are about the most surface level, broad, ideas about your community, and also the ideas of you being a victim or your community being victims of certain circumstances. This is to say that this gaze that is then imposed on you and your work means that you are in some ways restricted in the kind of stories you can tell. This is sort of a way of explaining why a lot of representational art has to do with things like suffering or oppression, which of course are important things to depict, but it becomes a problem when the vast majority of art that is being created about your community is centered around your suffering as opposed to other aspects of your humanity. And there are more ways of experimenting with stories about joy or empowerment when you are no longer bound by, again, things that have happened in real life. I think also intuitively, this is just true that because representational art is based on real life, and I think an average reasonable voter would believe that the real life, historically, for most minority groups, has been quite difficult and hard, then a lot of the stories then being made or popularized from that real life are also likely to be stories about suffering and pain, and oppression. I think a different way to sort of argue this is just by talking about how the idea of empowerment itself is quite limiting when it comes to the real world, because there are ways of visualizing power in speculative art that you cannot do in real life. In real life, power might look like someone from a minority group becoming a great athlete or a politician or a leader by the end of the film or story. But in speculative art, this can look like so many other things. You can experiment with what heroism or courage, or perseverance and resilience can look like, because you can create so many situations from scratch and then also play around with fictional characters and the qualities that you ascribe to them in so many ways. Um, and I think like an interesting way to phrase this set of ideas is also that speculative art is important in reclaiming the right to dream, because when it comes to communities who have been historically marginalized or oppressed, um, there's a lot of conversation about reparations or compensation for the financial or physical harm that was done to them. But another thing that things like colonialism or slavery or oppression take away from you is the right to imagine a better future for yourself, or imagine a life for yourself that is not the one that currently you are existing in. Speculative art is really important because it helps you envision so many different worlds for yourself, or envision yourself in positions of power that weren't otherwise never allowed to you. And of course, the more like fantastical stuff it is, oftentimes that is what also captures the interest and imagination for kids who look to pieces of art to envision the kind of world they want to live in, which I guess like also bleeds into the next sort of set of ideas about engagement. Um, I think the mechs here are fairly straightforward. Firstly, because speculative works of art aren't restricted by real world locations or time periods. You can sort of cross borders and appeal to people of various cultures and backgrounds. B, since the commentary or representation that you are trying to do is a bit more metaphorical and indirect, there's less alienation from the people that you are not representing, or the people that you are depicting in a negative light. So because the work then becomes less antagonistic, because it is more grounded in a fictional world with fictional characters and fictional situations. I think this is quite an interesting spec, but I think it's fairly provable, which is that you just have more outreach with speculative art because there's more room to do things to appeal to corporate interest and do things like merchandising or create ways for fans to engage with your work. So because like the intellectual property is entirely your own, you're not borrowing stories, or you are not trying to depict people who actually exist in real life. You can create comfort objects, or like sort of really lean into the fun or excitement that your story is trying to communicate. This can look like people cosplaying as certain characters. This can look like people buying merchandise of specific objects from your fantasy universe or sci-fi universe and whatnot. I think all of this, of course, can potentially exist in representational art as well, but it's just a bit more limited and less likely because of how um because like of how grounded all of the stories or characters are in real life. There's not a lot of room to come up with interesting things to merchandise out, or interesting ways of getting fans to engage with your piece of work. The third thing then on political commentary, I think some of this I've already talked about, but the ideas over here is that you can achieve more effective political commentary in speculative art because you can extrapolate from real world issues, but take them to their most extreme logical ends. So you can exaggerate problems in order to make them seem more urgent, like talking about Handmaid's Tale and bodily autonomy for women. Just really sort of setting that within a dystopian universe allows you to really magnify all of the problems that exist within the real world. and B, because of the distancing effect that you create, because it is fictionalized, it is in a fictional setting, there is less likelihood of backlash because you can still convey all of the political messaging through symbolism or allegory or metaphors, but you don't directly make people feel threatened by your piece of work. C, I think this is also important. The fact that a lot of experiences that minority groups face are things that are a bit more intangible and hence have to be portrayed in or visualized in ways that aren't grounded in reality, that require you a certain level of suspension of disbelief. And lastly, I think the reason that this political commentary is more effective is because it allows people to visualize the world that they want to live in instead of just the world that they currently live in. And that visualization is what leads to people taking more tangible actions towards social change and political change. Talking more about op case now, I think firstly, just engaging with what we've talked about prop saying about quality of art. I think there are ways to just, at the very least, mitigate it, but actively take over those ideas as well, which is that I think op can just argue or or sort of take down this idea that creative freedom is something inherent to prop side, because creative freedom can exist through numerous ways, and oftentimes it is good to have restrictions on some aspects of your art making, because that allows you to then experiment a lot more within those limitations. And this can look like you experimenting with more ways of storytelling, the kind of POV that you're using within your story, or the kind of visual effects or techniques that you're using. But also, even if prop is true that there's a lot more external oversight and scrutiny, then you as opposition can co-opt this by talking about how this also then means that you as an artist are more incentivized or required to do more research into the things that you are trying to communicate and depict. And that necessarily means that you find out certain truths or certain stories that otherwise you might have missed if you were only doing a little bit of research or only trying to depict the most obvious or well-known situations about your community. And C, because it is grounded in reality, representational art can perhaps create more deep, honest, and relatable moments or situations or stories. And that in turn means that you have a work of art that is pretty good. Second, in terms of outreach and audience, I think the first thing to just say is that this has the outreach that your work can have has to do with more mechanisms than just the kind of genre you're working in. It has to do with other aspects like, what you're seeing on your social media feed, who is endorsing it, when it was released, so on and so forth. And B, if it is true that proposition thinks speculative art isn't inherently tied to corporate interests like merchandising or fan culture, then that also means that you require a large amount of money to do that kind of thing and that kind of outreach, which is just something that many minority artists don't have, and hence don't have the budget to do things like a lot of very hi-fi special effects or to release merchandise of your products immediately in order to get people to care or engage with your work. So this is just like something that is inherently tied to the resources or funding you have. Whereas with representational art, you can create lots of pieces of art that don't require a huge amount of funding or budgeting, but can still be quite meaningful and authentic and raw. I think C is that because you are creating work that is grounded in real world situations, you're likely to get a lot more buy-in from people who have anything to do with that real world situation or place or context. And because it is grounded in real life, the emotions that you're seeing on screen or the stories can be more relatable versus, let's say, like a hero fighting an evil villain, which are not situations that the average person deals with, compared to things that are more tangible that can be explored within representational art, the process of migration, themes around grief, belonging, family, whatnot, that can, again, like create a appeal for your piece of work. I think last couple of ideas that I want to talk about is that like how oftentimes speculative art creates commodification or cultural appropriation. The mech for this is fairly simple because you as a minority artist, when you're working within speculative genres, in order to communicate that you're talking about your minority community, you need to borrow certain characteristics like their skin color or a certain way of dressing. But then a lot of other stuff is fictionalized, right? Because you need to do a lot of world building or character building from scratch. So what this means is you oftentimes end up borrowing the most obvious or the most apparent visual characteristic of your community, and that can lead to things like especially if prop is true about everything about fan culture and fan engagement with the characters. What this means is your audience, especially if they're not from the community itself, engages in things like cultural appropriation, where they wear costumes that they saw on TV, but the art wasn't fully exploring the emotional or cultural depth to those things. And a lot of then these things become part of um, part of the mainstream and lose sort of the more complicated or deep meaning behind them. I think something that opposition can make a big deal about is the role of art in creating evidence or witnessing of lived experiences. This is especially true because a lot of exposure that people have to those who are not like them and those who are from different parts of the world, it happens through art because people are, bound by laws of geography and borders and whatnot and time periods. So your first exposure to minority communities might come from the art that you are watching. Do you want then that exposure to be about things that are speculative or things that actually happen in real life? I think Opt can argue that that exposure is necessary in order to create political will and buy-in into your social justice movements and policy changes. That's why you need to depict real world incidents so people are actually educated about the things that you are trying to talk about. I think in terms of just quality of representation, you can also talk about why, because you are working from real life and there's less room to make things up, you're more bound to go deeper rather than broader and then look at things like intra-community differences or practices or differences within a particular community, because now you have more room or space to acknowledge those differences because you're no longer now catering to you're no longer now just treating the community as a homogenous thing that fits inside your fictional universe, but rather a set of more complex set of humans that all are different or nuanced in many ways. Of course, you can do this in speculative art as well. It's just that you need to balance the incentive to do that versus the incentive to do things like, creative world building, playing around with magical realism, and all of those other things that you then also need to do. Um, Lastly, but also very importantly, I think when your political commentary is indirect, as is the case with Proposition Bench, you lose a lot of things like accountability or direct confrontation, which is bad because, like I said, a lot of education that happens in the real world happens through pieces of art, pieces of literature, and pieces of media. So that necessarily means that you lose the kind of sense of accountability that you want people from majoritarian groups to experience, that guilt or that sense of remorse or sadness that historically they've been complicit in the kind of experiences that your community has to deal with. Making it into an allegory means that you also relieve them of this burden or this guilt, which can have impacts on, again, the kind of mobilization that you can do as a community for things like policy making or for other projects like documenting particular atrocities in order to fight for reparations or justice for them, so on. Okay, those are the ideas that I had for both sides. Hopefully, a lot of this would be helpful, regardless of what motion you're debating, because all of this is pretty common material to use in most art debates. And yeah, thank you very much.